But not all of the places detailed in the Gospels were always thought to have actually existed. For instance, in the Gospel of John, there is a story of Jesus healing a man who had been crippled for 38 years at the pool of Bethesda. For years, many would cite this story as an example of why the Gospel narratives could not be authentic. You see, there was no pool of Bethesda. It must have been a fictional place invented by John, who wrote about 50-60 years after Jesus' death. But then, in the late 19th century, archaeologists excavated this place and found a pool, the Pool of Asclepius, which was better known among Jews as the Pool of Bethesda. It's almost impossible to see now, but if we were to remove what's been built on top, we would see a pool with 5 porticos, exactly as described by John in his Gospel.
The Greek word for gospel means good news, and that's how the Gospels are presented, as something that actually happened in actual places, and interestingly, in front of real eyewitnesses.
There are more than 40 people mentioned directly by name in the Gospels, and more than 50 are referenced by their title and/or where they lived. Many of these people were witnesses to miracles of Jesus, and most would have been alive during the time the Gospels were written. The first readers of the Gospels could have and would have been familiar with some of these people, and they would have been able to talk to them about the events described in the Gospels.
The Gospels provide a rich, nuanced depiction of their hero. But unlike the superheroes of a comic book, they present him as real, as someone who actually existed and walked among us.
The Jesus of the Gospels possesses extremely human qualities. He had a blue-collar job. He was likable, relatable, vulnerable at times, and he enjoyed spending time with social outcasts. But they simultaneously present him as someone who performed miraculous acts. For many of us, that's a problematic quality of the Gospel's presentation of Jesus. But almost every historian and scholar would agree Jesus existed. So, what do we do about these difficult, harder to believe elements of the Gospel narrative?
One way to handle that is to do what Thomas Jefferson did. Just cut them out. Thomas Jefferson once described Jesus' teachings as the most sublime and benevolent code of morals which has ever been offered to man. But he was also a man of reason and couldn't accept the less empirically provable aspects of the Gospel narrative, such as Jesus' miracles and the resurrection. To him, those were simply crude expressions of the Gospel writers' misconceptions about Jesus. So Jefferson decided to basically create his own Gospel. It's commonly referred to as the Jefferson Bible, but he called it the Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. Done for his own personal study, it's a project that took him years to finish. To put it together, he used a razor to cut out portions of all 4 Gospels and place them together in chronological order, compiled in 4 different languages for reference. But if you try the project out yourself, you quickly notice that in order to remove the so-called miraculous elements of the Gospels, Jefferson really had to bend over backwards to include some of these teachings that were so precious to him. You see, in the 4 Gospels, many of Jesus' teachings and moral lessons are contained within and around a miracle story. So in order to keep his collection of teachings intact, Jefferson would often have to cut off one Gospel writer mid-sentence and finish it with a passage from a different Gospel, one taken from an entirely different context written by a totally different writer. The result is an interesting collection of teachings and a fascinating insight into the mind of one of America's greatest thinkers. But the Jefferson Bible reads similarly to how it was put together, chopped up. The narrative and thematic flow of the Gospels just isn't there, and its picture of Jesus feels incomplete by comparison. Jefferson's Bible, in effect, took the Gospels and made them like many other religious writings, a collection of teachings. Sure, it contains an abbreviated portrait of this man and the beautiful teachings that continue to benefit humanity to this day. But that's just the point. Where else besides the Gospels do we find these teachings of Jesus? And in these Gospels, this portrait of Jesus the man is inexorably tied to their portrait of Jesus as something more.
In the Gospels, there is no denying that Jesus performs acts that are hard for many of us to believe. Yet, interestingly, Jesus' miraculous actions are woven into a believable, credible narrative that is totally unlike anything from its era. The Gospels are filled with stories in which their human, even vulnerable hero moves through actual, existing environments and interacts with real people that have authentic reactions to what's happening. One such example takes place here, in the Sea of Galilee. The scene begins with Jesus deciding to cross the lake with his disciples in their small boat. But as still happens out on the Sea of Galilee, the weather turns. Soon a fierce storm arises. The waves are crashing into their small boat faster than they can get it out, and it begins to fill with water. Throughout this, Jesus is so tired and worn down from the day's work that he is still asleep in the back, resting his head on a cushion. His disciples are understandably panicked. They wake him up and shout, "Don't you care that we are going to drown?" Jesus wakes up, tells the waves to be still, and suddenly the wind stops. There was calm. Then Jesus turns to them with an unusual question. "Why are you afraid?" The disciples are absolutely terrified. They can't believe what they've just seen. As superstitious fishermen, they believe demons and dark spirits dwell beneath the murky waters that this tired man has just somehow commanded into silence. They ask themselves, "Who is this man?" This is the central question behind the Gospels. Every story, every word moves with purpose and intensity towards answering it. Everything we find in the Gospels is there for a reason. The closing words of the final Gospel, the Gospel of John, reference this saying. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written.
The gospel writers weren't interested in just writing down teachings or a code of ethics. They also weren't interested in simply recording a history of what happened in first century Palestine. Instead, they told a story of a man, a humble, blue-collar, complex, likable, oftentimes astonishing, real man. Because to them, he was so much more than that. He was the key to life itself.